Hello everyone, I Riya Pahuja from ETCIO welcome you all to the webinar Minimize Downtime, Control Your Critical IT Infrastructure Anytime, Anywhere. As enterprises look to reinforce their network infrastructure, connectivity finds new life in the form of out-of-band setup. The increasingly complex and distributed nature of businesses require a resilient network that ensures reliability. Enterprises are dealing with a workforce that is largely connected remotely, ensuring major business dependency on their networks. OOB delivers network scalability and performance that can deliver enterprises a competitive edge. For this very topical discussion today, joining us is an industry leader. Please join me in welcoming René Newman, EU Solutions Engineering Manager, ZPE Systems. Hi René, welcome to the session.
Thank you very much.
How are you doing?
I'm doing good, thank you.
Really well. René, before we go on to the discussion, I would also like to inform my attendees that they can drop in their queries and questions in the chat box provided. We will be addressing the questions in the end. Also, we are also joined by Jim Wilson. He happens to be the Engineering Manager, VP Sales and Customer Success at ZPE Systems. He's been kind enough to join us directly in the Q&A session, and he'll be helping us to answer your questions, attendees. Hi, Jim. How are you doing?
Good morning. Thank you very much.
All right. So, René, I guess our attendees are waiting to hear from you. So let's begin with your thoughts. Over to you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for the introduction, and a very warm welcome for myself to everybody who's attending the webinar. Maybe 2 or 3 words about myself. I was originally born in Germany, currently live in Ireland, and I'm in the IT professional business for more than 20 years with a quite strong focus on out-of-band data center management and in the networking space. So briefly about the company I'm working for. I'm working for ZPE Systems, and we were founded back in 2013 in the US, in Fremont. Since 2013, we have a year-on-year growth of roughly 85% revenue. And we achieved that by deploying over 1 million managed nodes to our customers. Our customers encompass anything, companies which are hyperscalers to pharmaceuticals, financial companies, oil and gas, retailers. Essentially, we are covering any vector in the business. And we have offices in the US, EMEA, India, and in South America and Brazil, to be more precise. We're currently a private company, a privately owned company, I should say, and our main focus is on providing management platform to our customers. So today we want to look a little bit closer at downtime, and for that, where we're going to start off is to just have a quick look at a couple of observations which we can see in the market space and in the enterprise business. Most of these informations are directly based on a recent report from the Uptime Institute. And specifically around downtime, what we can see is that while power is still a main cause for outage, we can see an increased proportion of customers reporting outages related to software applications or network failures. In conjunction with that, we can as well see that more and more of these outages are actually caused by the companies themselves. That can be anything from unplanned consequences to change, to really change gone bad, to just any other form of mistake which might happen on a daily basis. The challenge with that is that the outages in itself become bigger. They affect more and more data centers, more and more regions. They are felt far more widespread. So an outage which might have started off in a couple of years ago just in a specific region in India might now spread across the entire country, or might even cross continents. So you might have an outage in the US, which is felt in EMEA and in Asia Pac as well. And that just makes the outages far more painful to the business. Because of that, we definitely can see that the outages are not just limited to one specific data center anymore. They're definitely spanning multiple data centers typically today. And we can as well see that the industry is struggling quite a large bit in managing their complex infrastructure which they have. The infrastructure typically is made up out of multiple vendors which you might have. You might have them in different stages of the life cycle. You might have already some equipment which might be end of life. You might have some equipment which is brand new. So your equipment might span multiple generations from multiple vendors, which makes that a very, very complex infrastructure of different functionalities, which makes the management extremely painful to your team. On top of that, the data center trends which we can see currently is that the enterprise data center, as we know it, is definitely not going away. Companies appear to stay within the normal enterprise data centers, while there is still a trend going to the cloud. Some companies already found out that the cloud might not necessarily be the best place for them to be. So some companies are moving back to the traditional data center space. So the enterprise data center is very likely going to stay there for quite a long time going forward. But where we can see growth in the data center space is in the micro data centers. So these are smaller data centers which are typically deployed closer to end consumers, closer to your customers, closer to industrial applications or anything like it. So these are then just relatively small data centers, just a couple of racks. We can see them as well deployed far more together with 5G applications, which will leverage micro data centers in a far bigger scale than anything before. Another reason why we see these smaller data centers emerging is that the internet will move closer to the end consumer as well. It just makes sense for a Netflix or any other form of streaming service to host at least a cache of the content which they have closer to the end user, thereby limiting issues if they have an outage in one specific area to avoid that is having any effect in other areas, for example, reducing latencies, reducing bandwidth restrictions and any of that. With the emerging of micro data centers, we see as well that the complexity is definitely not going to get any less. So the way going forward to managing all of these data centers, all of these applications, all of these hardware appliances appears currently to be automation, automating the infrastructure processes, the infrastructure management. So any company who hasn't already looked into automation to some extent is very likely going to start doing it. Companies who have already at least looked at utilizing automation are very likely going to start adopting it in their day-to-day processes over the next short while. A lot of that will be driven as well by staff shortages. We already know that in certain regions across the globe, IT personnel is very, very hard to get. Trained personnel is essentially there's a huge lack of available workforce which are capable of managing your existing IT infrastructure. And that is only going to get worse. On top of all of these general trends and observations around downtime, we have now to deal with what we have seen over the last 3 or 4 months, where something happened which nobody probably in the business necessarily thought is going to be possible, that everybody is working from home and that the business can still maintain its proficiency. But what at least larger IT companies have seen, which had already a very large amount of automation and IT-driven processes in place, is that they were actually quite capable of having the workforce not being located in the office where they made the decisions, where they planned changes, but having the workforce actually located at home. And that has already led to a change in culture. It's we can see the first glimpses of that, and it has already driven some companies to make the decision to say, okay, look, what we currently have, the ability to work from home, we're going to extend that for our employees for an indefinite time. So beyond the pure period where we are currently forced to do it, where we are recommended to work from home, we're going to extend that work style beyond that period as well. Examples you can see here, Slack has already endorsed that. Couple of companies in India are looking into it as well, specifically around the IT teams, around the IT security teams, which would be quite familiar with technology and with remote access. So very likely what we're going to see here is that the workforce which is working in one company will drive demand for that work style in other companies in the same region as well. So how will that impact of downtime essentially your business or our business? Now, here, there's nothing really new there. Any form of downtime is it's a loss of productivity, it's a loss of revenue, it's a loss of business to your company. Now that essentially more and more of that business is done through a web interaction with your end customers or with your business partners, that loss of revenue and that brand damage, which you're going to see, it's going to be just far more dominant as your IT will become far more your backbone of a company. Customer satisfaction will suffer far more dramatically in that sense as well. And it will force any form of downtime will force your IT team to change from their regular working style, from their forward planning, from their elevating the company and the business to where they needs to be, to a purely unplanned crisis management situation, where all what you're focusing on is how can I get my business, my internet, my relationship to my customers back to the level it was before the outage or before the downtime. In relation to your work and your work team, really what we're going to see there is that agility, while it has been a buzzword for quite a long time, it's really going to be key now. Working from home has a completely different mindset is required. So there's far more agility, not only from the employees, but from the management as well, to embrace that. As I mentioned before, the expectations of a workforce is very likely going to change, and company cultures will very likely attune to these new requirements and to these new expectations. Your business resiliency is going to become a global requirement. So what we mean by that is, as I mentioned before, is outages are typically not just located anymore in a single data center in a single region, but outages are typically now affecting larger regions and can cover the entire globe in a worst case scenario. So your resilience of your business has to account for these kind of events. So how can I cover maybe a certain region with a backup data center in a completely different region? How can I provide service to my customers from and make the whole process more resilient and provide backup not only from a remote data center which is 20 kilometers away or a city away to maybe to a data center which is halfway across the globe or in a different country or somewhere else. There's going to be a requirement to review your existing solutions and applications which you use to manage your infrastructure. Here I'm specifically looking at out-of-band solutions, automation solutions. Some of these applications might not work quite well together. Some of these applications or solutions might be quite out of date. Specifically, out-of-band had a tendency to be deployed in what was considered a very secure network where very people have access to. And because of that, there was a tendency, I would say, to neglect the maintenance of that out-of-band solution up to a state there where it might not be fit for current security requirements anymore. And there might be other management tools, other management platforms which you have, which might fall into the same category. So it's definitely going to be an interesting one to see, to review what you have, assess it under the new requirements to ensure that it can still serve you and provide you with required management capabilities in a secure manner. And as we mentioned before, your network infrastructure will become the backbone of your business. Your network will not just deliver normal network services and connectivity, and will not just deliver services to certain parts of a company, but essentially the network and the network infrastructure will become the backbone of a company. Without the network, very likely your company will not survive for a very, very long time. So how will that affect me directly? Okay, if you look at everything, the effects are relatively simple to see. For one, physical access to my applications, to my physical hardware will be limited. There might be in a data center which is just across the road, but due to the current situation, I might not be allowed into the data center, or there might be in a data center which is a couple of 100 miles away, a couple of 100 kilometers away in a different city, on a different continent, or just in an area which is very, very hard to reach. So physical access will be very likely a thing where we just cannot rely on it anymore. The same thing applies then to smart hands, which were the typical solution for limited physical access. Smart hands can be a limiting factor depending how they're used. While smart hands are definitely going to be required for racking and stacking, for hardware exchanges, maybe hardware replacements or anything like it, there's a big question to be asked about, should I rely on smart hands for local troubleshooting? Should I rely on them to perform initial configurations of the devices or any of these forms of activity? The question here should be, is that not already tasks which I can perform through an automated method or through my own team? Essentially, all what I need is some form of access to my devices. Security is going to change because attack vectors are going to change on your business. Up until right now, as I mentioned before, people would typically gather in your corporate offices across the globe, and that would be typically deemed a relatively secure environment to work in. People wouldn't be necessarily exposed to foreigners. The network they would connect to, would be monitored, would be relatively secure. Now that they're working from home, all of that is changing. Essentially, the network which they're connecting through cannot be deemed secure anymore. And if we're looking, for example, at the Twitter attack, which happened a couple of weeks ago, the attack vector wasn't anything where somebody broke into an existing system or anything like it, but was done through social engineering, where specific employees were targeted, and then through those connections, malware was installed, from where then the attackers got access to management platforms, etc. So these kind of social attack vectors are, I think we're going to see more of them. And because of that, we will have to review how security works. Endpoint security, security of the local employees will be far more important, but as well, we will see different security models going to be implemented into our businesses. As I mentioned before, existing solutions will need to be reviewed if they are still up to date, if they're still providing me with the capabilities I need. And overall, all of this will enforce that automation will be adapted, as well as modern application deployments and configurations. If we look at cloud deployments from the hyperscalers, the big hyperscalers are not capable of deploying these large cloud distributions by upscaling their manpower, but they have done it through automation, by standardization, by ensuring that certain standards, changes are enforced, configurations are maintained between the different systems, and then they were able to utilize automation to upscale their business. It had an effect as well how applications are stood up. More and more applications are defined as stateless applications, so that means that they can be actually destroyed and then just rebuilt as needed. And we can already see a trend there that a very similar approach is moving into the enterprise space as well. So enterprise applications are very likely going to change over the next couple of years as well, to more facilitate a very similar work style, a very similar deployment style. Now, what will be the impact to your workforce, to your IT team? Communication is always key in any team. Before, that was done through meetings which you had in the office, through a chat which you might have over tea or coffee in the canteen. Now that is going to be reliant on any form of collaboration tools which you might have in the company. So they are going to be key. They need to be easy to use, but they need to be secure. You are going to have a requirement for secure access to your management infrastructure, either with a VPN or through a VPN-less access, as long as the security is there, as long as it can be trusted. You're going to look at a unified access to existing infrastructure. It's going to be difficult to manage 3, 4, 5 different management tools. So ideally, you want to have one tool which provides you access to all of your devices. And that should allow you access from the hardware layer up to the software layer. You're very likely going, or your team will require more visibility in the management infrastructure. So that means, for one, that they have to better understand how everything is connected, how everything is working together, but as well as what is currently happening in the infrastructure. As you mentioned, security is going to be a big part. So concepts like zero trust, single sign-on, multi-factor authentication will be far more common across the management tools. While multi-factor single sign-on is already quite common in certain areas, zero trust is definitely it's definitely already a buzzword if you look at branch management and smaller sites. All of the change in the security requirements will just force the deployment of these solutions and these concepts over the next year, or even 2 years. And last but not least, remote rollback and recovery options are going to become a must. As we mentioned before, access to your devices is going to be limited. You want to limit downtime. You will want to limit the impact of changes if they are negative. And for that, you need to have some form of a rollback which works all the time, regardless what the change was. So if I'm thinking about here deployment or change management processes, then I would expect that a modern change management process is going to plan a change, it's going to deploy the change. The change will have some form of success criteria which ensures that the change was successful, but as well that the key business services are not impacted by the change. And if any of that fails, that you have an automated rollback to minimize the effect of the change, the negative effect of the change to your business, to your downtime. Now, that leads directly to, okay, what should you expect then from a modern management platform, from a smart management platform, which is ready to take on the challenges which we're going to face over the next year, 2 years, or even today? For one, you would expect that it's going to be a vendor neutral solution. So it should not just work with specific hardware, with a specific software from that one specific vendor. That's not going to work. As we mentioned before, you have a hybrid infrastructure very likely in place. So whatever you put in place should be able to manage your entire infrastructure. And that should encompass anything from console connections to Ipmi interfaces to rack PDU sensors, IoT devices, or anything else you might have in your data center or in your remote sites. The solution has to stand up to your highest levels of security with an active support for all the software components, because that management platform, it needs to be treated as if it would be directly accessible from the outside. Even while you're accessing it through a VPN, even though it might be in a secure network, in a secure environment, because not everybody is accessing it remotely, it needs to be actively monitored. Access needs to be monitored. What people are doing needs to be actively monitored. So the concept of zero trust, separation, least amount of access, all of these concepts will now really apply to your management platform as well. Because of the remote access, you very likely are going to look at some form of fallback connectivity to the system. So while the system would normally work through your normal management network, so standard Ethernet and fiber connectivity are going to be a must there, but you're going to very likely look at fallback options in case there's an outage to the site and you require access. Now, in most cases today, we're looking here at LTE. Going forward, that might include 5G options or more landline-based solutions like lease lines, DSL connectivities in terms of physical connectivity. And then on top of that, you're very likely going to look at some form of IPsec VPN or even a VPN-less solution, which is utilizing certificates or TLS 1.3 encryption. The solution which you're going to implement should work together with the automation tools. As I mentioned before, we see that automation will be adapted more and more by companies. You don't want that your management tool is driving the requirement for just a specific automation tool or maybe for a second automation tool or anything like it. Ideally, the solution which you are implementing should support the automation tools and processes which you want to implement and which fit your business and your processes the best. So the management platform is here quite an important part. And lastly, your management platform. Traditionally, you had management platforms which did quite well in one specific environment, which did one specific thing quite well. Maybe they just required access, maybe they did management in terms of central management for certain appliances or anything like it. What we are seeing there now is that management platforms become multifunctional. They're not just providing one thing anymore, they're providing multiple functionality. So here we can look at, you might have a system which provides access and has directly a monitoring portion on top of it to provide more visibility in the connectivity and what is going on in the management network. So let's take a closer look at automation together with out-of-band. Automation originally started off in the DevOps environment where it was utilized to deploy servers, to manage services on a server, stand up instances, etc. And then it moved over to the networking space. But there's a huge benefit of combining automation with an existing out-of-band connectivity. And here are just a few examples why it can be of benefit. Some are more generic, like you can ensure consistencies of configurations across your enterprise. That applies to automation in general, but it applies to out-of-band in particular, as you can use automation to directly stand up your hardware appliances in a unified method. While many vendors are using ZTP nowadays to provision their devices, if you look close at the zero-touch provisioning processes, you will see that every vendor has a different implementation with different capabilities. And because of that, processes from one vendor to another vendor, or even from just different generations within your company, might be different. Using a console interface, an IPMI interface, allows you that abstraction as the access to the end device stays consistent, it's independent of the generation, it's independent of the vendor, and allows you access to a well-known interface, which is known by most, if not all, IT administrators, like the CLI of an end device, which they're quite familiar with. If you use automation together with out-of-band, you can utilize it as well, for example, to gathering logs, troubleshooting details. So if you have a downtime, if you have an outage, and your assistant administrator logs in, you can have already all the details gathered for you in one concise report, where the administrator can then work through it, review the details, and then actually better assess what the causes of an outage, or at least have a starting point where he has to look. Yeah, so automation and out-of-band is a very, very powerful tool and combination. Now, we mentioned already the word out-of-band a couple of times. I just want to take a short minute to review what is out-of-band, as the term might not be as familiar to everybody as it is to me. So out-of-band as a technology is around for quite a long time, over 20 years. And essentially it consists of providing access to an end device through a standardized interface. These interfaces are typically the the human interfaces which were available on end devices. So for networking devices would be a serial port, a console interface. For servers was traditionally the KVM, the keyboard with your mouse interfaces, and so on. For servers that changed to dedicated management interfaces, which moved into the servers, these are your IPMI interfaces. So they have depending on the vendors, they have their own names. HP is calling them ILO, Dell is calling them iDRAC, for example, etc. But you can find them on any kind of server today. The traditional out-of-band systems would provide remote access to the end devices. Typically, you have a management software going together with the out-of-band solution, which provided you with that remote access. There was typically some form of client involved, and you might end up with multiple management softwares which needed to be maintained and installed, depending on the solution you were deploying. So you might have one solution just looking after your serial console devices, which was maintained by your networking team. You might have one system just looking after your servers. You might have one system just for your rack PDUs and sensors, which was then managed maybe by your facilities team or by your data centers team. So most end customers ended up with multiple systems which need to be kept in sync, or they were just run completely independent. So really, access was here the key driver and was mostly used for break fix scenarios. So something broke, customer needed access to it, and he tried to use the system at that time. Now, how can a smart out-of-band solution look like? A smart system, as of today, and that is one thing which we are providing, would provide you access to all of these interfaces in a unified hardware and software solution. So you can deploy just one appliance, which can provide you access to your servers, to your rack PDUs, to your console devices, and it can function in multiple ways. You can deploy multiple features on top of it. But we're going to look at that a little bit closer in the use case in a second. So as I mentioned, I would like to review a little bit closer what we can offer as a company through a use case which we had with a financial corporation. So that company had already an existing out-of-band solution. It needed to be replaced due to the security standards which needed to be in place. And the basic goal was just to utilize the out-of-band system to prevent outages or to limit the impact of it. The basic requirements was hardened security to fulfill the requirements for the financial market. It had to replace existing solution completely. It needed to provide basic console access, and it had to provide a way forward for them to improve their recovery time and to reduce outages and downtime. They had a couple of stretch goals which they were hoping to achieve, and that included management of additional infrastructure which they had in the data center, like their servers and their sensors. They were looking at a full integration into their automation processes. That was really something they were really keen on, as it would really allow them really to drive down the mean time to repair and to prevent outages. And they needed an independent method of accessing the system in case the site went down. They were looking specifically for an LTE failover option in their environment. So what did we ended up implementing was we implemented our own Node-RED Manager platform consisting of multiple hardware appliances depending on the location, depending on the requirement. And we were actually able to fulfill all of their goals, not just the basic goals, but in the stretch goals as well. We were able to manage all of their console devices, all of the servers and sensors they needed to manage. And And within a very, very short time, they actually started to utilize out-of-band solution with their automation processes. And it actually proved to them extremely beneficial over for them surprisingly short period of time, where they could already see improvements to the resiliencies to changes and outages caused due to changes. So overall, the benefits which they saw from the solution was that all of the security requirements were there. They had additional headroom on the appliances and on the solution to provide additional functionality. They saw as well that there was additional headroom to be ready for future security requirements or any unforeseen requirements which might come across, and it improved their resilience of their existing infrastructure, network infrastructure. So that is a rough sketch of how it looked like. So we covered for them the main data centers where we manage the servers, their network equipment, the UPSs. We provided additional functionality by allowing them to run Docker applications and NFV applications with the main focus of automation and monitoring. And then later on, we were able to deploy the same functionality and the same platform in their remote offices and branch office situations there. All of that was connected together with an LTE failover option. All the sites were connected through a WAN and a VPN connectivity. And in case that all of that failed, they were using our own CPE cloud for a secure VPN-less access to specific management devices as a last way of getting in, so to speak. So that pretty much concludes my my part as such. If you want to get more information about us and what we are doing, feel free to take a look at our webpage, cpsystems.com. On our webpage, we have an ROI calculator specifically to downtime, which might be quite interesting to you. We have as well a Gorilla guide covering out of band. Feel free to log onto our webpage and to download the guide. It's quite an interesting read, I have to say. If you want to know a little bit more about myself, or if you want to reach out to myself, you can find me on LinkedIn as well. And that concludes the part of the presentation, and I believe we are going to move on to the Q&A next.
Yes, thank you so much, Rene, for that insightful presentation. We have a whole lot of questions here.
Very good.
All right, so first to go with, here it is there a way to increase the internet speed when connected via VPN?
So there are different ways of how you can do it. We directly have partnered up with multiple companies which provide internet acceleration or SD-WAN capabilities together with us. So then you essentially, the options which you have is you can utilize multiple links. So for example, our appliances utilize, you can utilize multiple LTE links, you can combine multiple internet uplinks which you have through either an SD-WAN or through a simple WAN acceleration. We have some capabilities directly on our platform as well, which allow you to combine multiple links or at least to have failover between the links. On top of that, there's always some fine tweaking which you can do around the VPN. VPN is always a little bit difficult if you are really struck with bandwidth and with speed accessing a remote connection. Probably a VPN-less connectivity might be an alternative, depending on what you want to do. So when we're talking about VPN-less, and we're talking about a secure access to the device through a TLS 1.3 tunnel, for example, which is encrypted, which is secure, but isn't reliant on the IPsec overhead, for example.
Sure, thank you for that. We have another question here. One of our attendees asked, when we talk about establishing IT infrastructure anytime and anywhere, how much is this infrastructure safe and secure?
Yeah, so the traditional method of securing the infrastructure was typically to hide it away somewhere in a data center in a very, or let's put it that way, the traditional method was in separating certain areas of your network out. You typically had your production network, you had your management network, which was then in the secured access. Many customers then use bastion hosts to connect to the management network or anything like it. Now, there are multiple ways of how you can ensure that the security there. The issue with that approach, though, is you need access to that bastion host, and that was typically limited to your office or to certain VPN connectivities. And it was then assumed as soon as you are in the management network that you were authorized to be there. There was no further checking there. So if you're looking at zero trust concepts, they essentially don't assume that at all. Zero trust means I don't trust that you are necessarily supposed to be here. So they validate every access. They ensure that if you're logging in, you are only allowed to do what you are supposed to be allowed to do. So essentially, to ensure that your infrastructure stays safe going forward, you will have to look at additional monitoring, at additional separation of your management network, maybe even provide a dedicated out-of-band network. That is definitely something which we can help with as well, where the whole out-of-band connectivity part is completely separated from any production network. But yeah, separation, monitoring, and limiting access, what people can do, it's going to be a key part of keeping your infrastructure secured. And you will have to make sure that it's that all your infrastructure is up to date. So security, patch management is going to be far more important than it was in the past. I don't think that anybody can just rely on the pure fact that a device is hidden away in my data center somewhere anymore.
Sure, thank you for that. Mr. Wilson, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, I think that Renee hit on it. One of the things that we also do is by being able to run additional applications. If you've standardized on Palo Alto firewall for your primary data path, we can do the same for your secondary data path, your out-of-band network.
Sure. Here is another question. One of our attendees says that we find a commonality in OOB and SD-WAN. Is there any similarity? Are they alike?
So that is a very, very interesting point. The basic concepts are not necessarily alike, but what we are seeing now is we see a very much a huge crossover. So SD-WAN, really the main focus was providing uptime to a remote site, correct? By providing resiliency to links, providing more bandwidth, getting away with leased lines and reducing costs to managing it. Now, one thing which SD-WAN is not dealing with though is, okay, what happens if there is a misconfiguration on the device? What happens if there's a misconfiguration of any of the other devices? Or what do I do in case I have to upgrade a device, a firmware upgrade or anything like it? So the traditional management challenges which you have with remote branch offices stay the same with SD-WAN, even if you have a centralized controller. Now, out of band, traditionally, the traditional answer there would be deploy an additional device, provide additional connectivity to that device, and then use that device to manage your router, your firewall, your SD-WAN solution. What we see with our application, though, is that you can merge those and that they are quite a happy marriage, so to speak. SD-WAN provides the resiliency to the links, provides the uptime to the remote sites, and the out-of-band portion of the solution provides the management capabilities to your remote site in a secure manner, correct? So while they are originally were separate, we see there huge overlap and a very, very good marriage between the two. And customers who deploy SD-WAN very likely on just white box servers, which have a limited amount of network interfaces or anything like it, they might struggle in certain situations. And that is where we can definitely help customers overcome those, and where we have actually quite good success in remote management and branch management solutions.
Sure. Well, a lot of questions are here to how can the attendees reach out to you? So do you have a base in India? Do you have an office in the country?
We do. As mentioned in the beginning, we have an office in India directly in Bangalore. We have a whole sales team there, which our customers can reach out to, or anybody who's interested in. So probably the best way to find the contact details is you can go through our webpage. There's a method where you can request a demo. You will see as well the details of our sales office in India there, and we can share with the attendees as well the contact details.
Sure, thank you so much for that. The next question here is, you mentioned about vendor neutral. So what products do you support?
So there we have to look at it a little bit diverse. So if we're looking at the standard interfaces, we pretty much support anybody and everybody, everything which has a console interface you can interact with. Anything which has an IPMI interface we can interact with, absolutely no issue. Going beyond that, we use standard interfaces, anything through SSH, RDP, VNC, we can access directly and manage. And in terms of rack PDUs and sensors, we have very rich support for all the vendor options. And really what we offer to our customers is I wouldn't necessarily claim that we support every single vendor, but what we can claim is if there is a vendor out there which you're using, come to us, talk to us. We're more than happy to look at the implementation and to support the vendor you have. But in general, we are already covering roughly 90% of all the different vendors through the standard interfaces which are out there. So I don't know if you want to have specific examples, but I mean, we can, on the networking side, we interact with Cisco, Aruba, HP, Dell switches, white boxes, and on the server side, specifically through IPMI, we support HP ILOs, Dell DRACs, IBM IMMs, Cisco UCSs, and
pretty much most of it.
Yeah.
Yes, sure. So the next question here is, when you said the automated deployment of hardware, can you explain a little more about that? What do you mean by the automated deployment of hardware?
Okay, so really what we mean by that is pretty much what the word in itself means. So traditionally you have the challenges that you get a piece of hardware and it needs to be provisioned. The traditional method is that the unit gets somewhere into a pre-prod environment where your engineers are connecting to the device either through the console interface or through any other means, and then do the initial provisioning and configuration of the device. So that might just include configuring a management interface and give it an IP address to allow the device to connect to a centralized conductor or orchestrator, or it might be to push a full configuration, let's say to a Cisco switch. Now, more and more vendors are supporting concepts like zero-touch provisioning, which in theory should say you just plug a network cable in and the device puts configurations from a DHCP server. But as I mentioned before, the implementations are actually quite different. So what we are saying is you can do the same configuration which was done before manually through utilizing automation tools, through the console interface or through your Ipmi interface. We have multiple customers who are using the console interface and interact with the CLI through an automation process, which configure the original management interface, which configure it, which push an entire configuration. And those customers are able to push a rack in, boot the rack up. Our unit is part of the rack. It's pulling down its configuration. It gets fully configured, fully provisioned, and then in turn, it uses its connection to power up the switches, the routers, the servers, provision the services on those, and bring the entire rack up to life. I mean, we have some customers who just literally push a rack in, and roughly half an hour later, the rack becomes live and is ready for production.
Sure. The next question here is, how many people can simultaneously work on this system from the same organization?
So officially we support up to 1,000 connections per device, so per box. So now if you're looking at a standard console switch, you have something ranging between 48 to 96 ports in the 1U unit. So that is typically averaging out at roughly 20 user sessions per port. But it's just an average. So you could have 100 users working on one port if you wanted to. And the way it works is there are multiple modes which we support. The default one is that the first user connecting has read-write access, or others have read-only access, or you can enable multi-write access, and that is then where the system will release the read-write lock after a short while, and then the next user can interact with the console. So.
Sure. And when it comes for costs involved, what is the approximate cost for covering a data center, and how many physical boxes will be deployed in a data center?
So the costs, I would strongly recommend reach out maybe to our sales team in India or have a look at our ROI calculator. In terms of units, that is it's a little bit hard to say because it will depend on the data center size in itself. In general, you can calculate the amount of ports you need. And here we're talking about console interfaces, maybe Ipmi interfaces and all that stuff. They will all require one port on one of our appliances. So if you have 1,000 ports, then you will need 1,000 ports on our appliances. In terms of hardware port density, we can deliver anything from an 8-port device to a 96-port device in a single RU. So for 1,000 ports, you would need roughly 11 devices. But again, it will depend a little bit on the physical distance, how the location is set up, but you could have 11 devices covering your 1,000 ports.
Sure. Renee and Jim, I suppose you're aware that India had banned a lot of Chinese applications because of data security perspective. And considering that my attendee has one question, he says, how much of the interference is Chinese in ZP systems? Is there any chance of passing data to them?
No, definitely not.
Yeah, no.
But Jim, you can answer.
So our development centers are in Brazil and India. The product is American manufactured and not out of China.
Yeah, so we have absolutely no links to China, actually, as far as I'm aware.
Sure, thank you for that. The next question here is, the attendee says we have standardized on Palo Alto for our firewall. Can this work with ZPE?
Yeah, well, and one of the things, this is Jim, I mentioned earlier, one of the keys is our ability to run NFVs on our systems. So if you've established Palo Alto as your in-band or data path firewall, we have the ability to run that out of band as well, so that your in band and your out of band are just as secure. It doesn't make sense to have an out of band connection that's less secure than your main data path.
Sure, I get that. It was so much fun speaking to you that we lost the track of time. It's almost time. So taking one last question here, considering that, what automation softwares do you support?
So as I mentioned before, one of the requirements should really be that your management platform ideally supports the automation tool you are choosing. So based on that, we have a wide range of support for automation methods. We start off with a very, very basic. So if you just want to use shell scripts, Python scripts, or anything like it, you can use those. You can even run them directly on our platform without any issues. If you want to use more existing tools, something like Ansible, Puppet, Chef, we have full support for those as well. So essentially, any customer so far who has come to us and wanted to automate, we were able to accommodate his automation requirements.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Rene, for that insightful presentation, and both of you for answering all our questions here. Dear attendees, we have tried our best to answer all the questions. In case you have more queries or questions, you can always reach out to ETCIO and CPE through our online and digital platforms. Thank you and have a nice day ahead.
Great.
Thank you very much.